This is Rise of the Third Power. This is an indie JRPG that's actually made by Stegosoft, and if that sounds familiar to you, those are the people that made Ara Fell. So this already has some sort of indie cred, you could say, because I know that Ara Fell was a very well-liked game with definitely quite nice writing, and although I've never actually played it myself, I do know that people like it for a good reason, and I've actually seen a bit of a playthrough of it actually just to sort of familiarize myself with it, and I definitely agree that the writing and characters and story of that game are actually quite good. And in this case, they actually set out to basically outdo themselves. I think they may have actually done that. So one thing to mention right off the bat is that this game is made by about 2 people, which is kind of incredible. They have said that there were some contractors and things for various parts, I'm guessing for like sprite work and maybe soundtrack. There have been some other people brought in here and there, but they've also said that roughly 90% of the game was just made by the both of them, which is pretty crazy. So the first thing to talk about is how it actually looks. It's going for a very chunky pixel art style, but with very, very detailed backgrounds. And the sort of juxtaposition of the very nice, colorful sprites with these sort of classic, old school pixel art backgrounds, they look really nice together, and there's actually a lot of character in the sprites, and also there's really nice animation detail in the sprites as well, especially during combat. The combat animations and particle effects and stuff look really, really nice. But of course, probably the most important aspect is the story. And in this case, they're going for a sort of political intrigue story that's actually done pretty well, in my opinion, and the backbone to the whole thing is that this world is sort of based on, think of something like post-World War I Europe, effectively. It's like 1930s Europe, but with a distinct fantasy bend to it, where, you know, there's a lot of tensions across various borders, and there's a lot of power vacuums that need filling and things like that, and there's a big, threatening, potential huge war on the horizon. And I think that's really the first aspect in the game's favor in a really big way, is that its writing is really nice, and there's sort of a risk when you're going for a more politically focused like intrigue, in that you have to be detailed enough in your depiction of the political climate of the world that you're in order to make people actually interested and engaged in the story. But if you're too detailed, it can actually get very dense and dry and kind of boring. So you have to straddle that line in between giving enough information to get the players invested while not giving them like proper noun overload and just boring them to death. And I know there's this sort of reputation that modern JRPG stories just totally go off the rails about halfway through and get like incomprehensible and real weird. That's just sort of how a lot of these games tend to be nowadays, it seems. But in this case, I think they actually do a really good job of making a grounded story, and it's actually quite easy to follow, while also still having enough unexpected twists and turns to keep you interested. The story never just totally goes off the rails. It always feels like you know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it, and it feels like there are actual stakes at play. And of course, important in any good story are the characters themselves. In this case, you will actually be getting quite a large party. You have an 8-member party by the end of the game, and each character is very well written, in my opinion, and it manages to do a good job of being funny at times and having good humor elements in it, while also not losing the plot. Because there's this thing where in some RPGs, you have this entire cast of characters that are all like cynical, sarcastic, quippy Joss Whedon characters, and that doesn't really work for me, because you gotta have at least some characters that take the plot seriously, or else it's hard to take it seriously yourself. So it gets kind of annoying when you have characters that do nothing but quip and try to make everything funny all the time. So it's nice to have a story that is actually serious and has real stakes, but at the same time, the characters have a good amount of like funny moments and comic relief. I mean, there were several lines that actually made me laugh, and that's a good thing, and that already, in my opinion, puts it well above average in terms of writing quality, because it manages to have funny moments and characters that can be funny, while also not constantly trying to be funny all the time, and actually having serious moments with like real emotion in them and stuff at the same time. But there's also a bit to say on the gameplay front, because it doesn't just go for like basic, standard, turn-based JRPG style of gameplay. There's actually quite a bit of new stuff. It's really sort of a mix between Eastern and Western RPG conventions that makes for an interesting fusion. First off, like I already mentioned before, the animations and particle effects in combat are really nice, to the point that they're actually a standout feature, in my opinion, of the combat. It makes the combat feel extra satisfying when things are all shiny and pretty, right? And they've even gone so far as to make the animations change a bit when you get a critical hit, so that makes them even more satisfying. And overall, I think the spell animations and the various attack hit sparks and things all add to the satisfaction of the combat and make it pretty enjoyable. Combats tend to be relatively quick, except for boss fights, which actually can last for quite a while, and tactics are important. Every character has a very specific kit, and every character is also very different from each other. There are not two characters that are very much alike at all. All of them have a very different set of abilities and spells and things to use, and synergizing them together is kind of necessary to do well in the harder combats. And you have an 8-character party, like I mentioned, but you can only have 3 characters in combat at a time. This is the first thing that this game does different to the traditional JRPG, is that you actually choose at the beginning of every combat which 3 characters you want. You do have the normal swap ability that allows you to trade out various characters for each other, but you can actually only use that a certain number of times per combat. I believe it's 3 times. So you have to be kind of careful about your overall party composition, and you're encouraged to take the 3 characters from the beginning that you want, and also switch out which 3 characters you're using quite often, because there's an exhaustion system where when characters, just as they take damage in general in combat, and especially if they get knocked out, even if you revive them, they take a large exhaustion penalty, and if exhaustion builds up to a certain point, their stats get reduced and they have drastically reduced capabilities in combat. However, not using them for a combat will lower their exhaustion, allowing them to sort of take a rest on the side benches there for a while. So you're encouraged to swap out party members pretty often and make sure that you're using them all well with each other while constantly changing your overall composition. Another thing it does very differently is gear, in that JRPGs tend to be very gear-focused, by which I mean the way that you make your characters stronger tends to focus on getting them new weapons and armor and accessories and stuff like that, whereas something like a CRPG is very level-focused, where you have, one level is a very drastic increase in power, but in a JRPG, generally speaking, the level-up system is like capped at 99 or somewhere around there, so one level isn't really that important. The thing that actually makes them drastically, noticeably more powerful is new gear. But in this game, new gear works very differently. Instead, everyone has only 2 weapons, and the first weapon is whatever they start with, and the second weapon is generally something you'll find in a shop or in a chest or after a boss fight or something later, and there's side grades to each other. One of them isn't better than the other. For instance, with your dual dagger wielding roguey character, her normal weapon is just the daggers, but the secondary weapon instead, it lowers her damage, so her overall damage is reduced, but it makes all of her bleed effects tick for twice as much damage. So if you're playing her more as like a damage over time character, it makes all those effects way stronger while making her base damage lower. So that's just how all of the side weapons work. There's some sort of alternate way to play them rather than just being straight up better or worse. And instead, when you find new equipment, it is permanently equipped on that character and they're stacking upgrades. Most of this is actually done via crafting, but you can also find and buy some of these upgrades yourself. So this way you don't have to worry about equipping each individual character with whatever is best from that shop at that time or whatever, as some other recent JRPGs like Astria Ascending have showed us. Managing 8 party members is actually kind of annoying sometimes depending on how the interface holds up, so it's actually pretty nice that this is the way that it works, that everyone has their own list of permanent upgrades that you can find and craft, and you are expected to just go through the game and actually find these things to make everyone more powerful as they stack up. I think it's a pretty nice way to still give depth to the character development, but also not make it really obtuse and annoying to manage. Everyone's also got that purple meter you see at the bottom of the screen next to their portrait, and that is a team attack meter. Different characters can have different team attacks with other members, and if you have both of them in the party at the same time and both of their meters are full, they can use these extremely powerful attacks by consuming that meter. These tend to be really, really nice, like full party heals with regeneration effects, or things like Black Hole that can effectively insta-kill like 3/4 of the enemy team. It's all really nice, and of course you're going to be saving a lot of these for boss fights at first, but you'll eventually realize that these meters actually don't take that much to fill up, and there are talents that actually make them fill up even faster. So using these is pretty important to getting through the more difficult battles unscathed or without building up too much exhaustion on your party. Another really neat change to the usual formula is how the level up system works. Traditionally, of course, you just level up each character individually, but in this case they've totally changed how that works. You have one experience gauge for the entire party, and everyone levels up at the same time, so individual characters do not have experience. This is probably kind of necessary due to how often you're supposed to be switching out your party members and not really always using the same 3 every time. That would mean that everyone would be very micromanaged and probably all different levels, and it would get very annoying very quickly. So instead they've made it to where when you gain experience, it is just to one unified experience gauge, and when that fills up, everyone levels up at the same time. When you level up, all of your team members get some increases in stats that are relatively small. However, you also get talent points, and every character, all 8 of them, have their own talent trees, which is pretty cool. And the talent points that you get are all in one pool that you spend individually, so that means you have to choose which characters you want to develop at that time. And as you go farther and farther into a character's tree, they get more and more expensive on talent points to continue to get new talents, so you will sort of be encouraged to splash several points into each characters' trees before you start dedicating more points to more advanced skills later on in the trees for individual characters. So yeah, your characters do actually build up quite a lot of power from levels, and then when you combine this with the upgrades to equipment that are permanent upgrades and things like the relics, which are permanent full party buffs that you can find and get from various side quest rewards and things, you can actually obtain quite a lot of power pretty quickly. But the game still remains relatively challenging, I've noticed, especially in the big boss fights and the other like end of chapter fights that are actually quite difficult and require a good amount of strategy to come out of them alive. And there's also some other optional things, and of course even like post-game super bosses and things like that if you want to find them. Overall, it just feels like a really very solid modern take on a classic JRPG. It's got enough about it that feels classic, while also having enough modern trimmings and things to feel new. It's in an interesting sort of fusion space between old and new and Eastern and Western conventions and things that makes it a kind of an interesting beast. It's also, I should probably mention, not a small game. It's being sold for a small price, it's only 20 bucks, but you'll probably get around 25 to 30 hours or so out of your first playthrough. Obviously, it's hard to generate like specific playthrough numbers for an RPG where there's lots of side quests and side content to do, so everyone's going to play it a little bit differently, but I would say around 25 to 30 hours or so for one playthrough is probably about accurate. I think it's really solid writing and its very engaging characters make this a must-play, honestly, for people that enjoy JRPGs, and the fact that it does quite a bit different with the JRPG formula might put some people who are aggravated and not fans of modern JRPGs at ease and actually give them something to enjoy. If you're more of a fan of like the Final Fantasy VI and before style, this actually does that pretty well, or say Chrono Trigger, for instance, is another good example of this kind of style of like old school JRPG. This is more like that, but with modern trimmings. I think the overall story and characters are definitely worth experiencing and something that you should be interested in if you like this style of RPG, and since I definitely do, I had a really good time with this game, and I think you will too if you like this sort of political intrigue story. It does a really good job. And the writing of the individual characters and the individual story beats and everything, it's a very memorable adventure. You know, there are parts of the story that I will remember for a long time because it's so well written and well presented. So yeah, that is my take on Rise of the Third Power. Definitely a must-play indie JRPG. Thank you guys very much for watching. The link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you wish to check it out, and I'll see you next time.